Hey everyone, welcome to another chapter review in Darren Hardy's The Entrepreneur Roller Coaster. This is for Chapter 2, Secure Your Shoulder Harness. The opening quote is a quote by Albert Einstein. Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. And I think he probably has gotten a lot of that. Both Darren Hardy and Albert Einstein had gotten a lot of that growing up and becoming who they were or who they were meant to be. He starts off by defining a couple of terms. The first one is freak. What is a freak? And Darren Hardy has the definition as a person who is obsessed with or unusually enthusiastic about a specific interest. And then he talks about what normal means. And he says normal is conforming to the standard or common type, also usual. So he says the usual or common type or standard society normal folks don't like it when a freak steps out of line, that kind of nonconformity threatens them. It challenges their choices and identity. Rather than step out themselves, it's safer for them to scorn you for your choices and attack you in hopes of dragging you back into the herd so they can feel better about themselves. I know that anybody who's experienced any kind of struggle in trying to grow themselves has always encountered people who will always try to bring them back. And Darren Hardy highlights that really well. He actually quotes a Steve Jobs quote that I believe was in an Apple commercial at one point. It says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify them, or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some see them as crazy ones, we see geniuses, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Darren gets into an analogy that I always referred to as crabs in a bucket, but he refers to them as the crab trap. Basically, when you go out crabbing, you'll have that trap that has some bait on the inside, and one crab on its own could typically get in there, eat the food, and get out. But the issue happens when a second and a third and a fourth crab get in there. Anytime a crab tries to escape, the other ones will hold him back, and that's why if any of you have ever seen Deadliest Catch, you always see those crab pots that are just hugely filled to the brim with all these crabs. Is because they don't allow each other to get out. And he explains that society is very similar, and most humans in the world, they follow the crowds. So the herd mentality has been conditioned in us by academia or the corporate culture, media, or society, and it encourages us to follow the status quo. So that means, like, as far as becoming an employee, that's the normal thing to do. So that's exactly what 90% of people do. That's anybody who tries to step out of that gets pulled back in and ridiculed or told that this is not something that they should be doing. So instead of encouraging or supporting people, friends or family and colleagues typically become crabby and start trying to drag you back into the trap, either by use of innuendo, doubt, ridicule, mockery, sarcasm, scorn, sneering. He uses a whole bunch of different verbs that basically means that they try to tear you down. So what he does explain is that when you step outside of the status quo, you become a giant mirror for those staying, and you reflect back their own cowardice. And I think that that's very true. He goes a little bit deeper in saying that they're afraid, and the choices that you make amplify their cowardice and makes it more obvious. That it's easier to make fun of you or try to convince you that you're doing something foolish, risky, or destined to fail in hopes that you'll give up and come back to the pack. That takes the mirror away. That's what he explains. So, and the second part of that is that maybe they just aren't courageous enough, right? They're not as courageous as you are. So because they're not as brave, it's easier to mock you than to follow you. Now, he does explain that if you get rejection from either a stranger or maybe a customer or something like that, it's not so painful as it is if it were a family member, a close friend, anything like that. That tends to cut a little bit deeper and you take it personal. But what he explains is that they're not really saying no to you. In fact, they're actually saying no to themselves. They're rejecting their own inner voice that tells them that they can do more, and as opposed to stepping outside of their comfort zone, it's easier to just say, you can't do it. So they give you the rejection, and it makes them feel better about themselves. He goes on to quote Gandhi in saying, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." Darren Hardy explains that you should stop being likable. Too many people try too hard to make everybody like them, and the people who make everyone like them or get everyone to like them typically don't accomplish anything in life. If you look at some of the greats in society, whether it be a president or a world leader, there are people who absolutely love them and follow them, and people who almost to the point of hate them. A great example would be Barack Obama. He had a great following of people who definitely loved everything that came out of his mouth, and then there were people who would just as well would have liked to see him, let's just say, not in office. But what you can't deny is the fact that he did create change. He shook the tree, the societal norm of what was expected of a president, whether it be through his social media or his publicity on TV. He did things differently, which caused America as a whole to change, and that progress came from him doing something different. Anytime you're going to do something different, you're going to get people who don't like you, and that's okay. So Darren Hardy says, be okay with that, because that's a sign that you're doing something right. He goes on to say, become laughable. And everyone knows that getting laughed at can be one of the most painful things that you can ever go through. But you look at some of the people who got laughed at, and this is one of my favorite people, but Elon Musk. How many people hear him talk about his grandiose ideas and say that is absolutely laughable? That'll never happen. But if anyone in the world were to ever make it happen, it would be him. And now people don't really judge him like that anymore, because they realize that if he wants to make something happen, he'll do it no matter what anyone else says. Walt Disney could be another one, because what did he buy? A field of an orange grove, and ended up putting a park that he said was going to be the happiest place in the world. And sure enough, he did it. He goes on to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a foreigner, said he was going to be an actor, ended up at the time being the highest paid actor, and then ended up becoming the governor. And he talks about also Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Jesus, Steve Jobs, Abe Lincoln, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Albert Einstein, all these names that at their time, Rosa Parks is another big one, they were laughed at. The ideas that they had, the concepts that were in their mind were laughable ideas, but they were the ones who were crazy enough to make some change actually happen. And people hated them for it. Regardless of who hated them for it, they still made change. And Darren Hardy goes on to explain that we need to define our own success. And very often success gets defined for us. I'll dig into that in a little bit. But he explains that when he was younger, he spent his whole youth attempting to impress his dad. Impressing his dad was going to be his definition of success, even to the point to where he bought this multi-million-dollar home with the most beautiful view of the bay, and it had a wall-to-wall, ceiling-to-floor window, and he wanted to impress his dad, and he brought his dad over for the grand reveal, and his dad started picking out all the flaws. And at that very moment, he said it was almost liberating, because he realized that that is a futile endeavor to try to impress his dad. So he doesn't need to impress his dad, because it's not about his dad. He says he finally got to let go of the burden that a lot of people never get to let go of, and it's the burden of living to please someone else. So he was free to pursue his own dreams for their own sake. Darren goes on to bring up a interview that he did once upon a time with Maria Shriver, who, as you know, was Arnold Schwarzenegger's wife. And in that discussion, he says he does bring up how, of course, her past comes from, being of the lineage of the Kennedys, and how their whole family was centered around making the world a better place and creating a better outcome for mankind. But she finally realized that that wasn't her mission in life. What she really wanted to do was to be the best mother, the best wife, the best daughter that she could be. She wanted to be a good, active role in her family's life, which brought up a huge question into Darren Hardy's own mind of what is his definition of success. He had never actually defined that for himself. He says most of us have never asked that question, let alone answered it. Or if we have asked it, we've unknowingly allowed others to give the answer for us. Maybe our parents defined it as degrees we should obtain, or titles we should aspire to on our business card. Or maybe commercial media defines success as having a car, that house, those shoes, that watch. Darren says, forget about the Joneses. Ask yourself, what is success to me? What makes me truly happy? What gives me joy? When am I most satisfied? How will I know when I've reached success, and what does it look like? Answer those questions from deep within yourself, and you can spark real insight, an awakening to your true motivation, passion, and purpose in life. Darren Hardy says it's important to get a grip, and by get a grip, he means gain some perspective. He explains how once upon a time he had a really, really rough day in the real estate world. He had just lost a deal to another real estate agent when his friend decided to console him by explaining to him about this Newsweek article that he had just read, explaining that on average at any given funeral, only 10 people care enough to cry, and that the most important factor on whether or not anybody went to the actual burial was the weather. So with that single conversation, he says his whole perspective on living for other people's approval changed. It changed because it helped him realize not to get caught up in what people care or what they think in the moment, because in the end, will these be one of the 10 people that are going to be at your funeral weeping over your loss? If they're not, maybe you shouldn't invest so much emotional bandwidth into them, which was, again, another emotionally liberating moment for him. And he talks about the 18-40-65 rule, which I thought was very interesting, which means at the age of 18, most people are very, very concerned with whether or not the next person likes them or not. It's all about being liked and seeking approval. By 40, most people realize that they don't really care. So we don't act as if we care what the next person thinks. We dress how we want to dress. We say what we want to say. And by the age 65, you realize that most people don't really think about you at all. They're really only thinking about themselves. The only time they think about you is if they're wondering how you make them look. Darren explains that it's really important to reduce your recovery time when you're getting this kind of rejection. And it's important to recognize that we're all going to face rejection. That's all part of growing and becoming. But understanding that sulking over it for 2 months, 2 weeks, even 2 days is a lot of time. And what he's had to work on was to recognize that there is value in every failure. There's the lesson, the opportunity to learn and to change things. So it's an evaluated experience. And if you're not taking advantage of that, then you get caught up in sulking. And so he says it's important to trim it down and make a practice out of trimming it down. So now he's at the point to where he doesn't spend more than 2 minutes of just sitting there and maybe being upset for a little bit, but getting over it quickly, finding out what the lesson is here and fixing it so he can move forward. And he explains that falling is good for you. And he talks about a story when he was out skiing with his family, and at the end of the day he went to his father all excited because he did not fall once the entire day. And his father essentially said, well, then you haven't really gotten better at skiing, have you? And he didn't understand at the moment, but his father went on to explain that when you fail, when you fall, you get better. That means you're practicing. That means you're challenging yourself and you're pushing yourself. And in order to get better, you must fall. You must push yourself. That's part of growing. And I'm going to close up by just reading one quote at the end of this chapter. He says, when people dislike you, know that it means that you're on the right track. When you get knocked down, know that it's going to pass and that it's going to make you stronger. When they laugh, laugh along with them. After all, they're not likely to cry with you. Embrace your inner freak, ignore the crabs, find your own success, and brave the dark days, knowing that a few good days are really, really good days. Overall, I thought this was a fantastic chapter. I really did get a lot out of it, and I hope you did too. If you guys have any other comments or anything to add, please feel free to leave them below, and don't forget to hit subscribe.